This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. In my house, I have a lovely, tall, antique, dark-stained wooden cabinet. But as much as I love that cabinet, it has a very old, dodgy magnetic seal on the front. Inside of this cabinet is a bunch of treasured items, as well as a collection of wine glasses and glassware. It's my fiance's pride and joy. So now that I've set the scene, let's rewind to a few days ago, where I'm home alone, headphones in, listening to a book, sauntering through the hallway, when one of my pet rabbits comes barreling around the corner toward me. Startled by this rapid ball of fur, and not wanting to see his sweet but frankly dim little face smash into my shin, I quickly take a step back out of his pathway, and before I even have time to register what's happened, my elbow connects with the side of this cabinet. A new horror began to sweep over me as I turned around and hear the distinct sound of a cabinet door opening, a wine glass container falling over, and glasses beginning to roll out. One of them rolling straight out of the now open cabinet door and smashing upon the ground. And without thinking, I quickly used my other hand to shove the cabinet door closed. And upon the closure, hear a distinct clonking against the other side of the cabinet door. The sound of multiple glasses rolling over and now leaning against the door front. The other glasses don't sound like they've smashed. But I know the moment I take my hand off this cabinet door, with near certainty, I know the rest of those glasses will push the door open and they'll all roll out to join their smashed comrades upon the floorboards below. So I take a second to figure out what I can do. If I try to open the door, I might be able to catch the glasses as it falls, but it could be multiple glasses, and I'm more than likely to drop them on the ground. Likely meaning having to replace even more wine glasses, and a possible very expensive trip to the vet when the rabbits keep running around. As I have a very important phone call in a few minutes, and my phone is in the other room. You see, right in this moment, I haven't missed my meeting, the rabbits haven't put their face in the glass, and I've only smashed one wine glass. But that's at this moment. If I stay here, it'll mean missing the important phone call, but if I take that call, it'll likely mean that 6 nice glasses will now be shattered in my hallway. You see, neutral, back or forward, there's no good options. Whatever I do, the situation will get worse. And the reason I bring up a story about shattered glass this week is we're talking about a nation which itself could roughly be analogous with a shattered glass stuck back together. A nation that, much like myself in this situation, will likely make things worse with whatever decision they make. The nation I'm talking about today is Pakistan, or to be more precise, a part of Pakistan known as Balochistan. You see, Pakistan was created during the partition of India upon the ousting of the British, designed to be a homeland for the Muslim populations living in the British Raj. But what we know is the borders of Pakistan today hadn't really existed before at any time. These new borders of Pakistan were really a British creation. See, the modern borders don't follow any cultural or tribal or even geographic lines. The nation of Pakistan is roughly a mosaic made out of the outskirts of other countries. These lines drawn on the map meant that the Punjab people were scattered between modern-day India and Pakistan. The Pashtuns were split between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the Baloch, the people we're talking about today, in the south of the country, were split between southeastern Iran, southern Afghanistan, and southwestern Pakistan. So rather than a nation like Bangladesh, which is a fairly ethnically homogenous nation, Pakistan became a bunch of pieces stuck together, a mosaic of a nation. And the government in Islamabad ever since has been working very hard to make sure those pieces stay in place. The Baloch in particular have it pretty rough though. You see, even though they have a resource-rich province on the coastline with the world's largest deep water port within it, they also have some of the worst living conditions anywhere inside Pakistan. And any calls for Baloch nationalism or separatism are also very regularly met with heavy retribution from Islamabad. From the Baloch side, they want better conditions, and they're met with brute force, which simply just ratchets up the tension in the situation. For Pakistan, like me, they're stuck with their hand on the cabinet door, fearing that if they give more autonomy to the Baloch and give them what they probably deserve, it may encourage other parts of the country to do the same. And then Islamabad worries about how quickly the situation could devolve into an effective free-for-all with different ethnicities in the country. If concessions are given to the Baloch, then the Punjabis are likely to ask for the same. They also can't afford to stay neutral in this situation, because right now Baloch protesters are attacking Chinese infrastructure in the region, attempting to make themselves heard. See, Chinese investment is one of the main things keeping the economy of Pakistan going at the moment, And if many more investors are scared away by these attacks, well, things are only going to get worse inside Pakistan. But Islamabad also fears cracking down any harder than they already have been. They have been cracking down pretty hard, as people are beginning to pay attention to the crackdowns. And as much as the international press seem to be underreporting this one right now, large-scale violence will likely bring about public pushback and even the beginnings of a new phase in the insurgency, which will certainly increase the global interest, and it'll likely scare away even more of the international investment Pakistan is frankly desperate for. So what can Islamabad do? Crack down on the Baloch and risk inflaming the movement even further? Bury their head in the sand and watch foreign investment walk out the door? Or accept the demands of the protesters, respect their rights, and risk beginning a path that ends in Pakistan collapsing into 4 smaller states? And no godly idea which one of them ends up with Pakistan's arsenal of nuclear weapons. So what is Pakistan going to do? And how do we arrive at this no-win crossroads for the country? Well, to help us answer that, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Melting a Mosaic.
As you know, Pakistan was created after the subcontinent was partitioned by the British in 1947. And the British and the whole partition itself is really problematic. The person who did the partition, Cyril Radcliffe, was a lawyer who had never been to the subcontinent, didn't know anything about any of the political issues plaguing the communities there, or what partition or what the demands of the Muslims and the Hindus, etc. were. And he basically just drew lines on a map and did partition. And of course, the subcontinent is already a really rich and diverse part of the world. Current South Asia alone has over 25 to 30 languages spoken, has over 20 ethnicities. It has about 1/5 of the world's population. It has all the major religions, including most of the minor religions practiced in South Asia. So it very much is a melting pot, and Pakistan is part of that melting pot.
Sahar Khan is a senior research fellow at the CATO Institute's Defense and Foreign Policy Department, with her research specializing in state-sponsored militancy, terrorism, counter-terrorism policies, with a particular expertise in India, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. She's also a member of the America-Pakistan Foundation and the managing editor of Inkstick Media, not to mention a longtime friend of this show, and we're thrilled to have her back on the show today.
Pakistan's issue really has been how to create nationalism, or how to create a nationhood. Now, of course, there would be many Pakistanis who would probably disagree with me to say that all Pakistanis have a sense of patriotism, and everybody in Pakistan, of course, is patriotic and wants Pakistan to prosper and all of that. But all of that is true. But I do think that the ethnic, linguistic, and religious lines have also become divisions that the government has used sometimes to its advantage, or has used to extract resources from places. And Balochistan is a really good example of this. And so Pakistan, long story short, I do think it's a mosaic nation. And the government over time has done certain things to create a sense of nationhood. Like, for example, Urdu is the national language of the country, even though only 8% speak Urdu. So the government is very aware of how divisive ethnicity and religion and linguistic issues have been. So they have tried to some extent to create a sense of nationalism. But in the grand scheme of things, Pakistan is still a very young country. So it's still grappling with issues of nationalism, which I think is something that many countries in the world can appreciate.
So we're entering this conversation talking about a minority group inside, majority Pakistan. But as much as Baloch is an identity and a cultural group, it may not be the whole story. See, there are Baloch inside Pakistan, there's Baloch parts of Iran, there's Baloch parts of Afghanistan, there's even Baloch living abroad, and there are differences between these groups. There is even differences between the Baloch that live in the northern parts of Pakistani Balochistan as compared to the groups that live in the south on the Indian Ocean. Obviously, the Afghans and the Iranians will have very different relationships with their Baloch populations, but let's go through the Pakistani relationship with the Baloch first. So how does Islamabad view the Baloch population and the Baloch state?
when I think of Baloch and Baloch people, I think of course, Pakistan's province, Balochistan, which is the largest province in the country. But again, I think it is fair to say that, Balochis are, a part of Iran as well. And they sort of span some parts of Afghanistan. And this kind of points to the rich history of Balochistan as well. And I think it is important for people to realize that, the grievances that plague Balochis today, the demands that they make from the Pakistani government, from the federal government today, and the resistance movements that exist today are very much rooted in pre-partition history and, stem back to various empires. So, for example, in the 1500s, Balochistan, like Afghanistan to its north, it became divided into zones that was controlled by the Safed Persian Empire and the Mughal Empire to the east. And this basically, created this Iran-Pakistan border of today, right? Talat was a princely state in the subcontinent that was mainly Balochi. And after partition took place, Pakistan basically absorbed Kalat. And that's basically where modern day differences have begun. So the way that Islamabad views the government in Balochistan or the provincial government is Balochistan, I think at a basic level, it's okay to say that they don't get along. But if we want to go deeper, the issue really is two parts. One is resource extraction. So Balochistan actually has the most mineral resources that of the country. It is also the largest province in Pakistan, but it's the most sparsely populated province. Even though it has all these resources like natural gas, various minerals, it has now the Gwadar ports, it's linked to the Arabian Sea, just like Sindh is through Karachi, it hasn't reaped the benefits. And the provincial government of Balochistan, this is one of their main grievances with the federal government, is that the federal government comes in, does all kinds of extractions, and any amount of money that they get from mineral resources or whatever, they don't give it to the provincial government. So the provincial government feels locked in, that it's unable to develop or provide services to its people, which is constitutionally supposed to do. So that's number one issue. The second issue, of course, has been the separatist movement. And this is something that Pakistan is very, very, very concerned about. And Pakistan is not, to some extent, Pakistan is a little paranoid. I think we can say that. But in this case, I don't think they're that paranoid. Again, it's rooted in history. And I don't want this to be sort of like a history lesson, but very quickly, Pakistan, when partition took place, it was West Pakistan and East Pakistan. East Pakistan in 1971 became Bangladesh after a very bloody and violent civil war. So basically, in 1971, Pakistan lost a chunk of its territory. Now, as a new country, as a post-colonial state, it is very, very concerned about territorial integrity and sovereignty, right? And again, Pakistan is not alone in this. I think many states almost all states, of course, are concerned about their territory. Now, this is also when Balochistan and the sort of the separatist movement had begun. There was always violence in Balochistan. The Baloch politicians felt that their concerns were not heard when the constitution was written, that the federal government constantly ignored them, and that they were not reaping the economic benefits of their land. And so this is sort of where the separatist movement began. But then in 1975, there was a law passed in Pakistan that's called the Suppression of Terrorist Acts. And this was passed by then Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And he basically wrote this law specifically to go after Baloch insurgents, because already there were whispers of demands that Balochistan wants a separate state too, right? If Bangladesh can do it, if East Pakistan can do it, why can't we, right? And Balochis are not just in Pakistan; they're in parts of Afghanistan. They are in parts of Iran. So why can't we be an independent state of our own? And Bhutto really wanted to squash it. That particular law, the 1975 Suppression of Terrorist Act law, eventually became the Anti-Terrorism Act of Pakistan in 1997, and it's called the ATA, and it basically forms the basis of Pakistan's anti-terrorism framework, right? But if you think about it, the anti-terrorism framework of Pakistan started with suppressing the Baloch resistance movement. And the federal government feels that the provincial government of Balochistan does not do enough to curb these separatists. Now, of course, the provincial government maintains that, of course, they do not endorse violence. What they really are concerned with is that resources are being extracted and that paramilitary forces continue to run free in Balochistan and wreak havoc and terrorize Balochi people. And that also Balochi people don't have proper services to education, to healthcare, to tax reform, to transportation, to any of that. And so these are sort of the two main issues that plague the relationship between the federal government and the provincial government. So Islamabad's view is sometimes they're a little wary of the government in Quetta, but oftentimes they are constantly arguing about, power-related issues, if that makes sense.
So one of the complicating factors in the relationship between Islamabad and Balochistan is Balochistan's relationship with the Indians, Pakistan's longtime rival. Whilst there is deep tensions between the Baloch actually have quite good ties with India. In fact, when you look at most social media posts, India is quite often referred to as a near brother state. So why have the Baloch made so much effort to make good relations with India? Is India looking to seek out and support separatist movements like Balochistan inside Pakistan to weaken Islamabad's position in the country? Or is there another factor we aren't seeing here?
The thing is, I'm not sure, but I also think it kind of makes sense that they would, And this, again, goes to the whole idea of how sponsorship of militant groups work, right? Militant groups, like all other groups in the world, they need money, right? Anybody needs money to function in the world. So they need resources, and they will look to anybody who will provide them certain resources. It could be money, it can be arms, it can be sanctuary, it can be, rhetorical, diplomatic support, what have you. Now, India and Pakistan's history, of course, is traumatic. They don't get along, I think is a simple way of putting it. But again, going back to history, in 1971, when Pakistan was going through its civil war, the Mukti Bahai, who were the independence movement, the Bengali independence movement in East Pakistan, they eventually did get some support from India, and that's how they were able to win and secede and become a separate state. Pakistan remembers this, right? And Pakistan cannot forgive India for this aspect of the war. And of course, Pakistan ignores all the factors that led to the war itself, which is like a separate discussion, but basically Pakistan cannot forgive India or forget it. So that's another reason why Bhutto in 1975 really went after the Baloch separatist movements, probably a lot more harshly than he would have had the 1971 civil war not occurred. Because again, he wanted to make sure that they were suppressed so that they were unable to get any kind of funding from India. Now, whether or not India is supporting Balochistan, it's a little unclear, right? Which could indicate two things. It could just mean that India is not supporting Balochi separatist movements, or it could mean India is so good at it that it's not open source data yet. But basically, the Pakistan government and its military establishment, they blame India very openly and blatantly for supporting the insurgency in Balochistan. They base their allegations on a reference to Balochistan by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi from the ramparts of Red Fort on August 15, 2015. They also cite the example of an ex-naval officer / businessman named Kugelman Jadhav, who allegedly or secretly was arrested by the ISI in Pakistan from Iran in 2016 and awarded the death sentence for his espionage. So India denies these accusations, of course, and it gets very upset with these and basically says that this is Pakistan's quest or strategy of deflection from its own sponsorship of Kashmiri militant groups. So right now it seems more like a blame game, Strategy-wise, I think it would make sense for India to at least try to help the Balochi insurgents. And whether or not Balochi insurgents are getting that help, all I see right now are just like allegations and analysis, no concrete evidence of this is what we see as India supporting Baloch separatist movements. Now, the question then also becomes is that would India want Balochistan to become separate, or for Pakistan to disintegrate, where Balochistan becomes a separate unit or one of those ungoverned spaces or what have you. I mean, personally, I don't think that's what India wants. It would be bad for India and India's own projection of its regional power. I don't think it wants more instability in the region. Already, it's dealing with instability in the form of its own sort of saffron movement, its own right wing religious nationalism, and the Naxalite insurgency that it's dealt with, and its border issues with China, and of course its relationship with Pakistan. So again, I don't think India wants Balochistan to become separate. I don't see what they would get from it. But again, whether or not they get outside support from India, it's hard to have a concrete answer on that.
Whilst there is this tension between the Baloch and Islamabad, can the planned investments Islamabad has for the south go ahead with confidence?
To be honest, they are going forward. China, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor began a few years ago. They've almost completed the first phase. One of the first phases was, building the Gwadar port, having it up and running so that it could serve as a sister port to the Tabahar port in Iran. And Gwadar is up and running. There's a lot of development. People are buying property there and moving there, etc. So it's done well in that respect. And CPEC is moving along. Probably it's moving a lot more slower than it was thought. And it's unclear whether the third phase, which was supposed to be done by 2030, whether that will happen or not. And CPEC itself has sort of been plagued by various issues. But in terms of Balochistan, when CPEC started, now, again, sometimes things look really good on paper and the ground reality is totally different. So on paper, one could argue, this is good. Pakistan needs infrastructure development, right? It needs energy sector reform. It needs power, like more electricity grids and more efficient electricity grids. It needs a better transport system, roads and railways, all of that. And China is a neighbor of Pakistan. It makes sense for China to do this. And Pakistan started with Balochistan, which again is the poorest province of the state and the one that needs the most infrastructure and is the least developed. So let's start in Balochistan. Baloch, of course, and this is where the provincial government is also involved. Balochi politicians, provincial government, and insurgents, they all felt, and I think they're right in this, that they were not consulted when CPEC or the first stage of CPEC was agreed on. They were not told about any environmental impacts. They were not told about what kind of revenue they would generate, what kind of jobs would be placed in the province. None of that stuff that really matters to them because they are the communities who will be impacted by the CPEC projects that are in Balochistan. And this again fueled the Baloch resistance to such a point where Baloch separatists actually attacked some Chinese engineers and killed a few. And in November 2018, I remember the Balochistan Liberation Army, which is a separatist group, they attacked the Chinese consulate in Karachi, killing 4 people. And their reason was that they wanted to stop what they described as Chinese oppression and reach into Balochistan. Now, China came back and asked the federal government if they could, mediate. Perhaps if China mediated between Balochi separatists and the federal government, it would help the situation. That obviously did not go well, as one would have expected. So, CPEC is a bone of contention, and sort of another bone of contention between Baloch separatists and the government of Pakistan. But I do think it's going to continue to go on because, again, CPEC is not just in Balochistan, it's sort of all over the country. And to some extent, at least Balochi politicians have recognized, especially the major party there, the Baloch political parties, there are 2 or 3 of them, and they've recognized sort of the economic benefits of having infrastructure built in their province. So while they're not really happy about not being consulted about the nitty-gritty of CPEC, they are ultimately okay with it starting there. So I do think CPEC will continue on, and it will probably continue to fuel the separatist movement as well.
Whilst there are Baloch nationalism and separatist groups inside the Baloch parts of Iran and Baloch parts of Afghanistan, we only seem to see these attacks and violence coming from mostly the Pakistani parts of Balochistan. Is there a reason that the Pakistani areas of Balochistan seem to be more militant about the separatism, or is it just that the parts of Iranian Balochistan and Afghanistan Balochistan don't tend to report as much?
So no, I mean, I think Pakistan is the one that has the most, they have the largest Balochi population. And they have, of course, the Balochistan province, which is the largest chunk of Balochistan, or the land that Balochis would eventually like. So yeah, I think it makes sense that Pakistan deals with it the most. The area in Iran that has Balochis, it's called Sistine Balochistan. But it's very, very small, especially compared to the Balochistan province in Pakistan. And again, it's mainly, Iran will sometimes go in, and it's considered like a lawless region where the Iranian government doesn't really have a lot of control. Some separatists will attack like Irani military, but again, it's very small in comparison. So I don't think it's fair to say that it's unreported. It's just one of those things that makes local news, but doesn't really make international news. And to be completely honest, all the things that the Pakistani army has done, all the atrocities that they've committed against their own people in Balochistan, doesn't sometimes make international news, right? So anything that's happening sort of in Afghanistan and Iran with the Balochi population most certainly is unlikely to make international news. So I don't think it's underreported. You have to look at the local news to really get what's going on the ground, to sort of get that ground reality. In terms of Pakistan itself, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Pakistan is the one that's been dealing with the most violence from Balochi separatists and insurgent groups. Mainly, there are two big ones: Baloch National Army and the Baloch Liberation Army, and both of them have attacked Pakistani paramilitary forces and Pakistani army and soldiers. So Pakistan is the one who's dealing with it the most. But again, Pakistan is also the one that's cracking down the most, right? Pakistan is not sort of sitting around letting Baloch insurgents get more power, right? I think Pakistan, a lot of governments suppress their own people, which is a really tragic thing of governance. But I think what Pakistan has done with the Baloch is really, really terrible. And this is something that Pakistan is now grappling with as it's dealing with other various movements. There's another movement called Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which started a few years ago, in which the Pashtun population has basically said that Pakistani military and paramilitary and law enforcement agencies racially discriminate against Pashtuns, thinking that they are all Afghan Taliban or Pakistani Taliban and other militants, when they are not, and there's no evidence of that. And so Pakistan is sort of grappling with that. There's probably less appetite for that kind of movement had it stemmed from Balochistan. But again, Balochis have been so suppressed by the Pakistani government that they cannot even start a civil movement, if that makes sense. So whereas you would have thought that like the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, there would be a Balochi version that would have started years ago. It probably should have, but they've been so suppressed that they can't start it, So yeah, I mean, I think this is a big problem, but Pakistan is not innocent in this. The Pakistani government is not some sort of agent that's just been lying around who's like a victim of Balochi separatism. Everything from what I've read and done research on, I think Pakistan has not been open to listening to Balochi concerns, to Balochi demands. They have ruled with an iron fist more than they should. And I think this has become a big problem, and that's why you see the insurgency where it is now.
As we talked about at the start, Pakistan is kind of a mosaic, roughly glued together by Islam during the partition between India and Pakistan, with the nation ending up as a collection of distinct states. Quite a number of analysts who focus on the region express concerns that, well, if the Baloch were to gain more autonomy, then the Sindh and the Punjab and the Gilgit Baltistanis and the Pashtuns would all push for autonomy as well. So what is your rebuttal to someone who would say that the idea of an independent Balochistan simply creates another balkanizing Yugoslavia situation inside a country that, I remind our audience, has nuclear weapons? Is this a concern of many analysts in the region?
Pakistan has a lot of issues, no doubt, but the Pakistani army is very strong. Since its independence, has been acutely aware of its neighborhood, which is a tough neighborhood, right? It has India on its east, they don't get along, but then they have Afghanistan to its west. And actually, the history of Afghanistan and Pakistan is even more troublesome for those history buffs out there, because Afghanistan actually didn't even want Pakistan to exist. So when it comes to territory, Pakistan is not messing around. And that's also why it's been so harsh on Baloch separatist movements. Any mention of separatism is met with violence. And this is because of the civil war in 1971, because Pakistan lost a chunk of its country, right? East Pakistan became Bangladesh. I don't know many countries that have experienced that kind of severance, and so that's something Pakistan is acutely aware of. I do know that there are certain factions within the Baloch separatist movement that call for a separate land or separate country for Balochistan, because that doesn't just involve splitting up Pakistan. That would involve Afghanistan giving up some parts of its area, like some parts of the Helmand province and Kandahar province are Balochi, have Balochi populations. It would involve Iran giving up a chunk of its land. So I don't think that's actually going to happen, to be honest. But if that ever happened, I think it would be really bad, because we're talking about a country that also has nuclear weapons. And I don't think the world really knows how to deal with a country that disintegrates that also has nuclear capability. So it's in everybody's interest for Pakistan to remain solid.
So Pakistan has become a bit of a regional Goldilocks problem for its neighbours. If given too much support, Pakistan becomes too strong, then the country may be bold enough to start to settle scores with Afghanistan, ramp up the brutal crackdowns in Balochistan, and even more aggressively sabre-rattle with fellow nuclear state India. Too weak though, and the country may break apart, and who knows what will be done with those nuclear weapons. And with a destabilised or decentralised Pakistan, the Baloch, once secured their homeland in Pakistan, may seek to reunite the other Baloch territories in Iran and Afghanistan as well. So this is not just an issue in Pakistan. On top of that, China also worries that its decades of investment between the west of China and its corridor through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean may be all flushed away. So the entire region is hoping to keep Pakistan in that Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold. But can this be achieved long term? And how will other players react when one side attempts to change the geopolitical temperature? Well, for that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Mowing the neighbor's lawn.
If you look at a map, it's very clear that Balochistan occupies a really critical geopolitical space, right? Balochistan and Pakistan's Balochistan sort of projects out on the Arabian Sea, and it serves as a gateway to Iran. It also serves as it borders Afghanistan, and it's also a gateway to the Middle East, to the Gulf area. So geographically, it's a really critical space. And indeed, there's a lot going on, which I know we'll get into in terms of geopolitical rivalries and so on.
Michael Kugelman is the Deputy Director of the Asia Program and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Michael's a leading specialist on Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, and their relations with the United States and the West. He's also the editor and co-editor of 11 books, and has written for the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, and other publications, covering topics ranging from the US policy in Afghanistan to terrorism, water, energy, and food security throughout the region. And he joins us today.
At least speaking specifically about the Pakistan province of Balochistan, it's a no-go area on many levels, in the sense that it's very difficult to have media. There's very little free media coverage there. Pakistan controls movement and particularly media coverage there. So it's not easy for reporters, whether from Pakistan or from outside, to go in there and report on things happening. So that could be, so that informational shortage, I think that could be part of the reason why it's not talked about as much, just because there's not as much press coverage as there otherwise could be, given that it's very difficult for journalists to operate and to report from Balochistan.
One of the things that has always interested me about Balochistan is the disparity between the defense world and the wider press world when it comes to this subject. So there are separatist movements all around the globe, ranging from Catalonia in Spain to Ambanzonia in Cameroon, and whilst those movements get some coverage by the press, Balochistan gets almost none. The press just doesn't seem to pay attention to this one. But security services, on the other hand, dedicate an inordinate amount of time and effort into keeping the tabs on Balochistan and its separatist movements. So why is there this disparity between such little press attention, but such major institutional attention on this particular movement?
Well, I mean, I think, again, talking about Balochistan in this case, particularly in the Pakistan context, it doesn't compare to separatist insurgencies that have been raging in other parts of the world. And it's similar in Sistan and Balochistan in Iran. You have instability, you have volatility, you have violence at times, but this is not an active conflict zone. But indeed, that is not going to appease intelligence operatives who obviously worry about any type of threat to the internal stability or the internal fabric of their countries. So indeed, Balochistan is a place that has long been a concern for the authorities, so to speak, just because of the past. I mean, if you look at Balochistan and Pakistan, there is a long history of insurgency, and indeed, as China has moved in, making Balochistan a cornerstone of its infrastructure investments associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, and specifically the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, that has certainly intensified grievances within the region, which have always been, in great part, rooted around this idea of the Pakistani state working to exploit local resources and deny any of the riches, so to speak, to local communities. And with China doing the same thing, working actively with Pakistan to do that, it has made local communities very unhappy and upset. There have been some protests, which of course have not gotten much media attention in Pakistan, but they are happening. And this all concerns the agencies. So for sure, the intelligence agencies. I mean, that's quite clear. And I think that Balochistan, if you sort of zone out a bit, it's just a very volatile space for many reasons. The Pakistan-Iran border has been a site of cross-border violence carried out by militants. That obviously is going to be a concern for the security agencies. And according to Pakistan, according to Pakistani officials, the insurgency or the separatists in Balochistan are supported by hostile actors, i.e. India. So obviously that's also going to be a concern for Pakistan. No one could dispute whether that allegation is true or how true it is, but certainly this is a concern and has been a concern of the Pakistanis for quite some time. If you look on the Iran side, if you look at Sistan and Balochistan in Iran has long accused the Saudis, of course, are the main regional rival of Iran, of trying to stoke trouble in that region and backing anti-state militants in Iran. You've also got the nuclear facilities in Balochistan, in Pakistan. So for all these reasons, this is a region that's going to be a big concern for security agencies, intelligence agencies. And I think that for them, they prefer that it not get as much attention within the international media and the public. They don't want attention drawn to the fact that you have these very volatile spaces. But indeed, there has been plenty of commentary, including what we're discussing today, about the region. But indeed, for those reasons I mentioned, you're always going to have a significant level of concern from these intelligence agencies, and that, of course, translates to a presence on the ground of these agencies.
One of the crucial reasons this area has become so important to Islamabad, though, is the China-Pakistan corridor, where goods could be trucked or trained from western China down the spine of Pakistan to the southern coast and the port of Gwadar. This would bypass the majority of the Indian Ocean, the Strait of Malacca, and crucially the South China Sea. It would also cut over 5,000 kilometers worth of a journey off between Rotterdam and Chengdu. At one point, some analysts were saying that China might send as much as 20% of its trade through this corridor, but these days, pretty little travels down it. So why is that? Why hasn't this corridor been more of a boom for Beijing?
Yeah, this is a critical point, that indeed the development of a port in the city of Gwadar in Balochistan, on the water right there, that was meant to be a signature project of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And indeed, it has not gone anywhere. There's been very little activity on the port, very little transit, not much going on. Efforts to build roads out from Gwadar, stretching through the province to the capital, Quetta, hasn't made much progress. And in terms of why, well, there's a number of explanations, interpretations. One is just it's gotten caught up in the broader malaise of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, where a lot of the hope for progress hasn't panned out just because of financial problems. And I think that China could conceivably be concerned about the security conditions in Balochistan, a concern that I think has increased over the last year or so, as Chinese nationals have been attacked in terrorist attacks by Baloch separatists, and at times by the Taliban, by the Pakistan Taliban. Again, these attacks have happened outside of Balochistan as well. But, I think that Beijing is willing to tolerate a lot of risk in its investments in volatile spaces. I mean, you look at the history of its investments in areas of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and agriculture and other spaces that are known to be hotbeds for volatility and violence, and they've still invested there. And they've invested in Pakistan, even though several of their nationals have been targeted in recent years. But I think that as the intensity of these attacks on Chinese nationals has picked up over the last year or so, I think that has given it some pause, and wanted to be more careful about how present it is and how active it is in building up these projects. And in fact, there have been some news reports in recent weeks, including in the Asian Nikkei review, that China has actually requested that it bring in its own security into Pakistan to protect its people there. That's huge if true, in the sense that for many years China has brought many of its own inputs into Pakistan, labor, capital, of course, technology, but it's never brought its own security. It's always depended on Pakistan for that. But if it's so concerned now about security that it's wanting to bring in its own folks, well, I think that says something about its broader perceptions of the security conditions on the ground, and especially in Balochistan, which again has been, the main locus for CPEC activity in Pakistan, but also has been, a constant source of volatility and threats directed at the Pakistani state and its development activities there, but also the Chinese state as well. So, bottom line, I think is a combination of factors here. Why there hasn't been as much progress in infrastructure development in Balochistan as hoped for. One is, the financial situation. Pakistan has been struggling. It's been hesitant to take on more Chinese loans, and China's own concerns about security conditions on the ground.
So these attacks are mostly happening against Chinese and Pakistani infrastructure inside the Pakistani parts of Balochistan. But are there other attacks happening in the Afghan or Iranian parts of Balochistan? Are those movements over there as militant as these ones are?
Yeah, so in terms of quantity, I think that there have been more in Pakistan. I mean, this does not mean that there have not been attacks in Iran. There have, but as I understand it, much of the violence has consisted of cross-border violence. Now, in terms of Afghanistan is interesting in the sense that there is a history of Baloch separatists taking up sanctuary, safe havens in Afghanistan to escape the Pakistani military, which has sought to go after them. And they keep a low profile in Afghanistan. Now, what's unclear with the Taliban now in power in Afghanistan, or it's been in power for almost a year now, the question is how the Taliban regime will deal with these Baloch in Afghanistan. And we have seen one of the notable trends in militancy in the region in recent years has how there's been these new link-ups between Baloch separatists and Pakistan Taliban militants. Now, what that means for the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is a separate group from the Pakistani Taliban, but is very much allied with it on many levels, spiritual, ideological, operational, does that mean that the Taliban in Afghanistan is going to try to extend some type of support and assistance to these Baloch fighters that have taken up safe havens in Afghanistan. That's not known, but it certainly is a concern for Pakistan, which, as I had said before, accuses India of backing Baloch separatists. Now, there are also innocent Baloch, non-militants, just the Baloch civilians who have fled to Afghanistan as well, fearing violence from the Pakistani state. So it's all very complicated. But to get to your question, my understanding is that when you want to look at issues of violence and the threat of violence, that is largely centered around Pakistan, around Balochistan province in Pakistan. As I said, you are starting to see these Baloch militants carry out attacks outside of Balochistan, elsewhere in Pakistan. But I do think that the sources of violence mainly are within the Balochistan province in Pakistan, more so than Iran's Balochistan.
If China does end up deploying troops into Balochistan, will it just be to protect the port area of Gwadar, or we might see them running operations in other parts of Balochistan as well, whether it be inside Quetta, which is quite far from the port, or down the transport corridors? How widespread do you think the Chinese counterinsurgency operations here might end up being in the long run?
Well, everywhere, just because the entire province of Balochistan in Pakistan is an area that China has targeted. I mean, there's been efforts to build roads stretching from Gwadar to the capital of Quetta. So really, I mean, that means that if you look at this from the perspective of China's interest, the entire province is very significant in the sense that it's had plans and it has carried out plans to do development work in many different parts of the province, not just in Gwadar.
Well, in a scenario like that, let's say Chinese security forces are protecting Chinese workers building a bridge somewhere in Balochistan, and a riot breaks out over the Chinese workers getting paid more than the locals. Things get out of hand, and the Chinese security forces open fire, killing 50-odd Baloch. How would Islamabad likely respond to that?
Deep as the relationship is between China and Pakistan, and as much as Pakistan gives China a lot of leeway to do the types of things that it would not let other countries do in Pakistan. And that includes, quite frankly, cases of Chinese laborers actually beating up Pakistani police forces for not letting them leave their base camp for social reasons. That's happened in the past, and it took a long time for Pakistan to make arrests of those Chinese laborers. At any rate, as much as Pakistan gives China and Chinese nationals in Pakistan a lot of leeway, I really think it's put its foot down, because it would fear the very type of nightmare scenario that you lay out, that if Chinese security forces are in Pakistan and there's some type of attack and Chinese security forces respond by opening fire and kill dozens of Pakistani civilians, that would be obviously a nightmare on many different levels, and that's not what Pakistan would want. But let's be honest. I mean, if this trend keeps playing out of Chinese workers continuing to get attacked, even after Pakistan has repeatedly pledged to provide full support, keeps failing to do that, then things could get a bit dicey between Pakistan and China, because the security issue in Balochistan it has become what I would describe as one of the relatively rare tension points in a China-Pakistan relationship that otherwise is very robust and very warm.
A number of the analysts we spoke to for this piece told us that there is a genuine worry inside the government in Islamabad that if Balochistan were to gain independence or even wide-ranging autonomy, that it would create a balkanization of Pakistan, that the Sindh and the Punjabi and the Pashtun would then all call for similar concessions, and the end result would be ripping Pakistan into 3 to 4 pieces. How credible do you think those fears are?
Well, I mean, I certainly recognize that is a fear harbored by many in Pakistan, certainly within the public and also within the state and the military and the intelligence agencies, because, it is important to acknowledge that, in 1971, there was a war that resulted in the independence of Bangladesh, and that entailed Pakistan losing a very large amount of its territory because, of course, present-day Balochistan had been known as East Pakistan until 1971. So there is this long-running fear among many of Pakistan, not everyone, but quite a few folks, and certainly the nationalist crowd that you allude to, that indeed the Baloch are trying to replicate what happened in 1971. And of course, the fact that India supported the Bengali independence fighters, that plays into this as well. And it sort of plays into this allegation of Indian support for the Baloch cause, because after all, India helped break up Pakistan one time. Why wouldn't it want to help do it again? So I could acknowledge and recognize the fears, but quite frankly, we talk about how Balochistan is a hotbed of volatility, and you have a insurgent movement there, but there is no capacity. There's zero capacity on the part of these separatists to actually successfully carve out a separate homeland. I mean, they've been crushed by the Pakistani military for decades, and this is another reason why there have been so many problems, in the sense that the Pakistani military has used scorched earth tactics in Balochistan to crush this insurgency. And you still have Baloch militants. They're still there, but they don't have the ability to mount a successful insurgency and defeat the Pakistani military. It's simply not going to happen. And in that sense, I would look at what they've done with their attacks in recent years more as not an indication of weakness, but an indication that they lack the ability to do what they may otherwise want to do, like wage an actual insurgency to defeat the Pakistani state in Balochistan. They're carrying out attacks when they can, including in soft locations, against the Pakistani state and Chinese targets as well. That's what they do have the capacity to do. And the fact that they are getting support now, in some cases from the Pakistani Taliban, that helps ramp up their capacity as well.
In the last few decades, the US has prioritized stability in Islamabad over the rights of the Baloch, stating that as bad as the situation is at the moment, a balkanized or even a separating Pakistan would be far worse. So what are the US strategic aims inside Balochistan? What is it hoping to gain from this current position?
Yeah, so certainly I would argue that the US is very careful about or certainly what it says about Balochistan, but also how it looks at it. It recognizes that Balochistan is an extremely sensitive area. And indeed, I mean, the US, even though we could talk about the uncertain future of the relationship between the US and Pakistan, it's a workable relationship, and the U.S. wants to maintain a relationship with Pakistan. And it's true that some may have thought some years ago that it's better to be on Pakistan's good side than its bad side because of its nuclear weapons issues and its history of militancy and so on. I'm not sure if that view is a dominant one in Washington now. I think it's not a priority, and you don't have people in the administration saying, "Oh, we really got to prioritize making this relationship work." But there is a desire to make it work on some levels, to have a baseline of cooperation in a variety of spaces, and so trying to sort of get involved in the Balochistan issue would militate against that goal, just because this is something that Pakistan doesn't want anyone getting involved with. But from a perspective of U.S. interests, yes, Balochistan will be of concern, because what is the main U.S. interest in South Asia, and specifically Pakistan? It is stability. Very broad, very big, but that's what the main interest is. And indeed, when I had said at the top that you have a wide array of sources of what I would describe as instability, concern, volatility in Balochistan, because of the insurgency, because of the presence of Pakistani intelligence, because of the cross-border militancy involving Iran and Pakistan, because of concerns about India's influence, and so on. That, I think, is something that will certainly keep the U.S. alert to what is playing out in Balochistan, for sure. But you don't see, and you will not see, U.S. officials make an issue of Balochistan in either way.
Obviously, there are a lot of accusations about India funding the Baloch movements, but how far would India actually be willing to push this? Does India actually see any benefits from a collapsing Pakistan over its border?
Yeah, I mean, I think that India doesn't have interest in a civil war in Pakistan. It certainly does not want to see that happen. And certainly one could raise questions about the possibility of Indian intelligence operatives backing the Baloch separatists in some way, sort of to push back against what Pakistan has done with groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, right? I mean, we know, this is a fact. This has been well chronicled in research and scholarship that the Pakistani intelligence agencies have provided backing to anti-India militant groups, and specifically Lashkar-e-Taiba, which carried out the 2008 Mumbai attacks, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which has carried out attacks as well. So, given how Pakistan has leveraged militant non-state actors to an advantage, you can't rule out that India's been doing the same thing to an extent, but it hasn't been as proven with the scholarship. And so I think that, sort of stepping aside from that, more broadly speaking, India doesn't want Pakistan to see a full-fledged insurgency. It doesn't want to see balkanization. Now, you may have some hotheads or some talking heads that are looking to draw some attention, may talk about how that would be great to see a free Balochistan. But I think in terms of official state policy, you're not going to get that at all. I think that for India, its main focus on Balochistan is in Iran, where, I'm sure we'll get into this, it's been trying to help Iran develop its ports, Chabahar, which of course is very close to Gwadar. It's on the Iranian side of Balochistan. That's been an important policy objective for India, to help Iran develop that port and develop accompanying infrastructure so that India can hasten access to Afghanistan and onward to Central Asia. So I think that's where India's focus is on Balochistan. Its focus is on Chabahar, much more so than everything happening in Pakistan's Balochistan. Obviously, it's keeping an eye on it for its own reasons, its interests and security reasons, but I think that it wants to focus a lot more intently on Chabahar in Iran.
Currently, most of the attacks against infrastructure, against Chinese-funded infrastructure inside Pakistani Balochistan. But do you think we're likely to see Baloch separatists attack Indian-funded projects in Chabahar in Iranian Balochistan? Or will things continue to pretty much be limited to the Pakistani parts?
Compared to the types of security stresses that Pakistan and China face in Gwadar, in Pakistan, it cannot compare. And maybe part of the reason is that just like there's been a lot of setbacks to progress in Gwadar, there's also been a lot of setbacks in progress in Chabahar. And a major reason for that is that India has limited its financial commitments to Chabahar because of the U.S. sanctions regime on Iran. And, we've talked so much, there's been so much commentary in recent weeks about how India is not going to let the sanctions regime on Russia get in the way of its engagements with Russia. But, India has a special relationship with Russia that it does not have with Iran. It has a good relationship with Iran. Much of it has been driven by economic cooperation, including hydrocarbon imports over the years. But India does not have such a strong relationship with Iran that it's going to be willing to defy a U.S. sanctions regime in order to pursue its interest, unlike in the Russia context. So India has been very cautious in engaging financially with Iran on the Chabahar port project. Now, another issue is just the slowness that you tend to get with India in these efforts. India is a democracy. It's a bit of a messy democracy in the sense when it comes to implementing policies, it can take a long time because of a need to get various stakeholder approvals in India, consultations, all of that. It could just take a long time to implement plans. Now, Iran has been raring to go. India has wanted to move forward, but also have been these bureaucratic and political slow-ups. But I do think the sanctions issue is what has most impacted the slow progress with Chabahar. And given that there hasn't been as much going on, it suggests there hasn't been as much of an Indian presence on the ground in Chabahar. That would, I think, suggest that there wouldn't be as much of a need for enemies of India and Iran, for that matter, to try to target that area. But the other interesting thing here is that the Saudis obviously are always looking for ways to undermine Iran, their regional rival, and that includes wanting to undermine Chabahar's development to the extent that they can. But Saudi Arabia has an increasingly close relationship with India. Particularly, I think it's seen that as India has slowed down its commercial cooperation with Iran, Saudi Arabia has sought to swoop in, and India has also sought to strengthen its relationship with Saudi Arabia, particularly in terms of energy cooperation. So I think that the Saudis would perhaps be very careful in terms of their own potential ulterior motives or goals to engage in nefarious activities in Chabahar, because they wouldn't want to alienate their growing relationship with India. So there's that very interesting Middle East geopolitical aspect to this whole thing too. The Saudi Arabia-Iran rivalry, how India fits into that, and what that could mean for the safety and the security of Chabahar. It's a very interesting area to look at.
As the international community continues to get more and more invested into the security of Balochistan, do you think we're likely to see stability go up or down over the long term?
Well, I think the main signpost will be the story of Chinese investment in Balochistan. If CPEC continues to lose momentum and you just don't see as much of a Chinese presence there, then that could calm things down in the sense that the Baloch separatists will have one less grievance. And I think that be difficult for Pakistan to continue to engage in infrastructure development in Balochistan without the types of Chinese assistance that it was getting. So in other words, if you have less of a footprint of the Pakistani state and certainly the Chinese state in Balochistan, that could calm things down for sure. But I don't think China would want to reduce its footprint in Pakistan. Balochistan and broader Pakistan continues to be a major priority area for the Belt and Road Initiative, which I don't think Beijing is ready to let fold just yet. So that's what I'll be watching, is to see what type of presence you have of the Pakistani state, and particularly, and also China in Balochistan, because that'll drive the grievances and that'll sort of give an indication of what the insurgency will try to do. And then there's the other issue, the sort of the murky issue of the Indian factor, the Indian role. If it's true that India is providing some forms of support to Baloch separatists, that certainly could weigh in on this broader story. And keeping in mind the broader geopolitical dynamics, India is a bitter strategic rival of not only Pakistan but also China. And so, as the India-China relationship continues to struggle, as the India-Pakistan relationship continues to struggle, if India believes it can derive advantages from backing a violent non-state violent non-state actors like Baloch separatists that target both Pakistan and China, well, certainly there could be advantages for India in that regard. And if a group like the Balochistan Liberation Army in Pakistan is able to get external support, then obviously that'll strengthen its capacities.
So the US have chosen to back Islamabad, citing stability over sanctity. But who are the Chinese and the Iranians back? Will they seek to boost the Baloch movements enough to threaten Islamabad in hope of gaining better trade deals? Will this lead to the creation of a Cold War between an Indian-backed Baloch and a Pakistani-Chinese-backed security force? Or will all of these regional powers seek to suppress the movement to protect their own treasures? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. Finding the Fault Lines.
It's a religiously based state made up of several ethnicities joined together solely by the fact that they're not Hindu but Muslim, in perpetual conflict with India over Kashmir and really over the division of British India going back to the Raj.
James Dobbins is a senior fellow and distinguished chair in diplomacy and security at the RAND Corporation. He was also the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, Special Assistant to the President for the Western Hemisphere, a Special Advisor to the President, Secretary of State for the Balkans, and Ambassador to the European Community. Dobbins also served as the Special Envoy for Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kosovo, Bosnia, Haiti, and Somalia for the administrations of Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. And in 2013, he returned to the State Department to become the Obama administration's Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we're thrilled to have him on the show today.
It's a state dominated by the army, and the army is centralized, although of course it has regional commands, but they're not driven by regional considerations. They're driven by national considerations. That holds the country together. The politics are more regionally oriented. The parties, although national, have their strength in different regions, and there are separatist and regional parties that don't want to belong to Pakistan.
So for people who maybe don't follow Pakistan as closely as you do, how powerful is the Pakistani army? How much influence do they have on the nation's politics?
Well, it's pretty opaque. It's usually by results that you can tell who's behind the scenes making decisions. The army, of course, has taken over several times in Pakistan's history and governed the country directly. But for the last decade and more, and for most of the time, Pakistan has been governed by elected governments, but the army has sources of control and influence by reason of its importance in the state that is often deployed to influence the government and to replace the government. So the army occasionally intervenes directly, but more often exercises its influence indirectly.
In the period during the Afghanistan war, when the security of Pakistan was crucial to the viability of the US operations inside Afghanistan, obviously the US worked very closely with the Pakistani government at the time. How harshly was the Pakistani government cracking down on Balochistan separatism in the south?
Well, it's been a long-running insurgency. The army practices a variety of tactics. It co-opts groups that it can. It tolerates groups that it has no choice, and it represses groups that it can. I think in the Baloch case, it's been mostly repression, but obviously not entirely successful.
Obviously, Islamabad makes the claim that a lot of the Balochistan funding and support comes from India hoping to weaken an internal Pakistan. How true do you think that actually is? Do you think India is funding the Baloch separatist movements in order to try and weaken Islamabad's position and draw strength elsewhere?
Well, I think it's plausible that India is aiding the movement. It would be consistent with India's interests in foreign policy to distract Pakistan from making trouble in Kashmir, for instance, sort of offsetting the kind of militancy that Pakistan encourages in Kashmir against Indian rule by tit for tat.
During the majority of the US war in Afghanistan, many of the Taliban fighters and supporters would regroup, resupply, and even train over the Afghan border into Pakistani Balochistan. Quetta, the Baloch capital in particular, became a hub of weapons and men transiting into Afghanistan. In quite a number of documented cases, it was Quetta where things would be assembled before they transited over the border into Afghanistan to fight the Americans. So why would the Baloch be so open to assisting the Taliban? Were they doing it for religious reasons or money, or supporting the Pashtun Taliban in hope that the Taliban would return the favor and help their separatist movements once they get into power? Why did the Baloch offer safe haven to the Taliban for so many years?
The relationship between the Taliban and the Baloch was really influenced by national politics, by the army and by the ISI, the Army Intelligence Agency, who wanted to keep the Pakistani Taliban. Well, first of all, they didn't want to increase the number of separatist militant movements in Pakistan that were trying to overthrow the Pakistani government, and therefore they weren't willing to crack down on the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, because they had enough enemies without making another one. But beyond that, they had an offensive reason, which was to keep India off balance and diminish Indian influence in Afghanistan. And they saw an interest in keeping the Taliban alive. I mean, I think the United States back in 2001 was successful in persuading Pakistan to abandon support for the Taliban government. But what it didn't understand for 4 or 5 years, was that the Pakistani government had abandoned the Taliban government, but not the Taliban.
And what was the Indian end goal into giving the support to these groups like the Baloch separatists?
Well, I think you'd get different answers from Indians and Pakistanis. Pakistanis naturally saw it as a malign and directed at them. India's relations with Afghanistan were generally based on an Afghanistan that was peaceful and not subject to inordinate Pakistani influence, not an area where guerrillas, where insurgents could be trained to operate in Kashmir, for instance, or terrorist movements that had India as a target could organize.
After the Baloch attacks on the Chinese port of Gwadar, the Chinese have offered Pakistan to provide security for the port themselves, either through private Chinese security or deployed Chinese soldiers. But do you see this as just a first step in a situation where China might end up sending larger deployments to combat Baloch separatism movements in an offensive manner in the name of keeping Chinese investments secure?
Not really, no. China has been remarkably successful in avoiding support for insurgency movements and involvement in local civil wars. Now, Chinese foreign policy has been changing recently to a more adventurous, if you might say, but that's been only on the margins. That would be a change which would have considerable ramifications more generally if it became customary for China to do that.
One of the areas the Chinese have flagged as a potential danger spot is Quetta, just over the border from Afghanistan. Even though the Taliban have taken control of Afghanistan now, Quetta still maintains quite a lot of arms dealers, drug smugglers, and insurgent support infrastructure. Do you think Quetta is still a potential danger spot for the government, or are these worries overblown and these groups have moved their support infrastructure over the border back into Afghanistan?
The Taliban, it's true that the Quetta Shura probably has mostly moved to Afghanistan. Quetta Shura was the Taliban leadership structure, and that's moved to Afghanistan for the most part, although I'm sure they have had some roots in Pakistan. As to other militant movements besides the Afghan Taliban, there are many, and they're all prospering. A number of them are operating in Afghanistan.
The US has always prioritized making sure Pakistan maintains stability above all. So does the US support Pakistan's insurgency crackdowns on the Baloch separatists, prioritizing Islamabad's stability over the Baloch's call for autonomy?
Well, yes. I think the US wants to see Pakistan suppress or deal successfully with the various militant movements and to stop itself supporting militancy, which of course is part of its strategy of offsetting hostile militants with friendly ones. And if a crackdown was called for, I don't think the U.S. would have any difficulty with it.
And in the past, what sort of support has the US offered for these crackdowns? Is it just intelligence, or is it military assets, or is it photography? How involved are the US with these crackdowns on the Baloch public?
Well, I think it's more a question of how much help Pakistan would want and be ready to acknowledge. The U.S. was pretty heavily engaged in supporting Pakistan's anti-insurgency, anti-militancy efforts a decade ago, and a series of incidents and crises in the relationship led to a diminishment of U.S. involvement, U.S. military support. In fact, a cutoff of it, and it's not really resumed. Now, this was largely focused on the northwest frontier province and the areas bordering Afghanistan there, where the Haqqani network and other Afghan militants were operating.
Obviously, we can't predict the future, but at this current point, do these separatist movements in Kashmir and Sindh and Balochistan work together against the government of Islamabad? Or, frankly, they're much more regionalized and they don't really function together?
They're all operating against a single enemy. So I suppose there's my enemy of my enemy is my friend, but I don't think there's much coordination.
And what is standing in the way of the Baloch actually achieving a separatist state? Is it a lack of money? Is it a lack of coordination? Is it a lack of international support? What is the big hurdle that they would need to overcome to be able to gain more traction toward the separatist movement?
The army, after the Pakistani security services, and the lack of any international support. Insurgent movements usually require a foreign sponsor, a neighboring country that's willing to harbor insurgents, provide them a safe haven, a place to train, a place to recruit, a place to fundraise, and project their insurgency into the neighboring country. And that's lacking in this case.
So the Baloch are striving to achieve a more fair outcome. They watch Islamabad come in and sell their land to the Chinese and extract the resource, allow locals to get beat up, and still the basic infrastructure in the majority of the province is the poorest in the country, with a lack of proper schools, hospitals and support systems for a region in a province already struggling with water shortages and regular weather events. But where can they actually turn to for support, as the US wants to take no chances on destabilising or splintering Pakistan, as once you roll that dice, it's a big unknown which way the country will go. Yeah, you might see a properly democratic reforming government come into power, but just as likely you might also end up with a Pakistani version of ISIS, who are now in charge of a nuclear arsenal. So as much as Islamabad and Washington differ on a number of issues, Washington has chosen to stick with the devil it knows. So what about China? Well, China too would prefer to have the Baloch movement crushed, as it threatens the crown jewel of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the port of Gwadar. Beijing exclaims that what's the point in investing millions of dollars into a trade corridor if no one wants to use it due to the threat of attack? And as tough a decision as this may be, the deciding forces may not even be Islamabad or the Baloch, as Balochistan has a very similar regional problem to the Kurds in Kurdistan. See, whilst the Kurds have an elevated amount of autonomy inside Iraq, its neighbours are acutely aware that if it were to become a state, then there would have to be a discussion on where to draw the borders, which in the case of the Kurds would mean taking a chunk of Turkey and Iran and Syria. So neither of those countries are looking to have that discussion. For the Baloch, drawing a new set of borders would mean starting a civil war in southeastern Iran and opening up a new front in Afghanistan between Kabul and the Baloch parts of the south of the country. Iran and Afghanistan have very little appetite to be redrawing the borders, adding to the now deafening chorus of nations now working against the Baloch. And as much as the Baloch want or even deserve their autonomy, there are entire blocks of regional and international superpowers that are standing in their way. Thanks so much for tuning into the show this week to talk about one of my favourite subjects, territorial disputes and their economic repercussions. You listen to it, so my poor fiancé doesn't have to. It's been another busy fortnight here back at the Red Line HQ, with video productions ramping up and work continuing on a number of big projects coming down the pipeline, so keep your eyes out for that. But to get informed right away with all of our upcoming events and everything we're up to at the moment, you can find all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Discord and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This episode is dedicated to friend of the show, Naja Nick, who's the latest patron to sign up as of time of recording. This show is only possible with the support of our listeners like Naja, who donate a small amount of money each month to help us keep this show going, and we cannot thank them enough. If you feel you can spare a couple of dollars, we would greatly appreciate it, and it helps us keep this show independent. So, this episode on the struggles of Balochistan is all thanks to you, Naja. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Pakistan, The Baloch Conundrum by Tilak Devasha, for a look at why Balochistan greatly complicates Pakistan's politics. The second is Balochistan, The Height of Oppression by Azad Singh Rathore, for a look at some pretty graphic stories on how the Pakistan military cracks down on the Baloch. And the third is The Battle for Pakistan, the bitter US friendship and a tough neighbourhood, discussing the US angle to this story. I want to thank this week's guests, Sahar Khan, Michael Kugelman and James Dobbins. All of you, as always, absolutely fantastic to work with. I also want to thank my staff, Wade McCarr, the producer, Perry Grace, Danielle Isabella, Isaac Gibbs, Andrew Garbery, and Robbie Sutton, our research assistants and writers, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Ross Crabtree, our media advisor, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. We are incredibly lucky here at the show to have the best of the best working for us. The Red Line will be back in another fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Redline Podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.